What happens when trust is shattered and love is betrayed? John thought he knew his wife, Lexi, until the day he discovered the truth. She said she was going to a spa, but he followed her, straight to a hotel and into the arms of another man. Can their relationship survive the lies, or is this the end of everything? Watch as secrets unfold, hearts break, and one man must decide if he can ever forgive. The real question is, can he ever move on? John leaned back in his chair, staring blankly at the computer screen. His office, usually a sanctuary of productivity, felt oppressive today. It was 3 p.m. and the soft hum of the city outside barely reached his ears. His thoughts were elsewhere, thoughts of Lexi. The past few weeks had been different. It wasn't one big thing, but a series of small shifts. Little cracks that were easy to ignore at first, but now they seemed to loom large, impossible to ignore. He remembered when things were simpler. Lexi would walk into the room, her bright smile lighting up everything, and he'd feel like the luckiest man alive. But now the cracks were beginning to show. Her routine had changed. At first it was nothing, just the occasional late-night meeting at work or a last-minute call from a friend. But the pattern was undeniable now. Lexi was spending more time away from him, her phone more frequently locked away, and the distance between them, once imperceptible, now a chasm he couldn't cross. John had always prided himself on his ability to trust, but recently, that trust had started to feel like a fragile thing, as if it could break at the slightest touch. He hadn't said anything to her yet. He wasn't sure how to. How could he? He didn't want to sound paranoid or worse, like he was accusing her without reason. But it was there, the suspicion. His fingers tapped nervously on the desk. A text from Lexi pinged on his phone. "Hey babe, I'll be late tonight. Just wrapping up some things. I'll see you later." He read it twice. He'd received messages like this before, but something felt off today. It wasn't the message itself. It was the way she'd phrased it, the abruptness. It seemed so unlike her. "I'll be late tonight. Some things." He couldn't explain it, but something about that didn't sit right with him. Lexi wasn't a woman of vague details. She was precise, specific. She wouldn't have just left it at that. But it wasn't just the text, was it? It was everything. All the moments he'd brushed off, the random spa days, the sudden long nights with clients, the late-night calls she kept taking outside. John ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. He had tried to ignore the sinking feeling in his stomach, chalk it up to stress at work, maybe even a little insecurity, but now it was impossible to deny. His mind raced with questions. Had she been meeting someone? Was she having an affair? The thought hit him like a punch in the gut. But no, he wouldn't jump to conclusions. Not yet. He wasn't that kind of man. He decided to wait. Watch. Maybe there was another explanation. Maybe he was being irrational. But the more he thought about it, the clearer it became. Something was wrong. Something was changing between them, and it wasn't something he could fix with just a conversation. He looked down at his phone again, his heart pounding. "I'll be late tonight." He sent her a quick message, keeping it casual just to keep the conversation going, to see if she'd slip up. "Everything okay? Just want to make sure you're safe?" The reply came fast. "Yeah, just busy. Don't worry about me." That was it. No explanation, no reassurance. He stared at the screen, his stomach tightening. He knew something wasn't right, but what could he do about it? Should he follow her? Should he confront her? His mind raced, his emotions torn between love and doubt, trust and suspicion. The woman he loved, the woman he'd built a life with, was slipping through his fingers, and he didn't know how to stop it. John closed his eyes, trying to shake the feeling of unease. He had to trust her. He had to. But there was something else. A gnawing feeling at the back of his mind, something he couldn't ignore any longer. Maybe tomorrow he'd follow her, just to be sure. The day had started like any other. John kissed Lexi goodbye as she rushed out the door, her usual bright smile not quite reaching her eyes. She had mentioned the spa again, another needed day for some much-needed relaxation, a retreat she'd been frequenting recently. But as she drove off, something gnawed at the back of John's mind. He couldn't shake the suspicion. He had tried. After all, he loved Lexi. He trusted her. But that gnawing feeling wouldn't let go. John sat in his office trying to focus on the mountain of work piling up on his desk, but his thoughts kept drifting back to her. Lexi hadn't always been this distant. They had been close, really close, but now it was like there was a wall between them. The texts were short, the phone calls even shorter, and the late nights were becoming more frequent. She would disappear for hours with vague explanations. His phone buzzed, another message from Lexi. He glanced down quickly. "I'm off to the spa now. See you later tonight. I'll call when I can." John hesitated before typing a response. Part of him wanted to ask her where she was really going, to ask for the truth, but he stayed calm, keeping his doubts hidden. He didn't want to seem paranoid. He loved her too much. "Enjoy the day, babe. Be safe." She replied almost instantly. "I will. Don't worry. Love you." The words were like a dagger in his chest. They felt hollow, the same words, but without the warmth they used to carry. He swallowed hard, trying to push the discomfort aside, but the unease in his gut only grew stronger. As the clock ticked by, John's thoughts became more consumed by what he had seen, and more importantly, what he hadn't seen. Why hadn't she given him a real explanation? Why the repeated trips to the spa, the phone calls that were always too busy to talk, the sudden absences? His mind wandered back to that hotel receipt he had found in her bag. He hadn't told her about it, but it burned in his memory. He could see the name of the hotel clearly in his mind's eye, the confirmation of her lies sitting like an unbearable weight on his chest. He couldn't just sit here anymore. He had to know. He had to follow her. If this was a test of their marriage, he would pass it. He had to. John glanced at the clock. 3 p.m. Lexi should be arriving at the spa soon. He couldn't shake the thought that she was doing something else. The decision was made. He grabbed his coat and walked out of the office, his pulse quickening. He would follow her. He had to know. As he drove through the streets of Los Angeles, the city felt different. It was like he was in a fog, his mind racing, his body tensed. What if he was wrong? What if he was overreacting? What if there was an innocent explanation? His thoughts spiraled as he followed the familiar route Lexi usually took, the weight of suspicion pressing heavily on his chest. His eyes locked on the road ahead, but his mind was elsewhere, consumed by the possibility of what he might discover. When he reached the area near the spa, he noticed her car was not in the parking lot. His heart sank. She hadn't gone to the spa at all. He drove past the entrance, keeping a safe distance, but his eyes never left her car as it pulled into a nearby hotel parking lot. His breath caught in his throat. The realization hit him like a punch. Lexi was at the hotel, not the spa. She was meeting someone. John's heart began to race. His hands trembled as he parked down the street, out of sight but close enough to watch. He couldn't stop himself. The betrayal, the lies, it all hit him in a rush. The woman he had trusted, the woman he had built a life with, was keeping secrets from him. He didn't know how long he sat there, staring at the hotel entrance, waiting. The feeling of betrayal gnawed at him. This wasn't just about suspicion anymore, it was about his life, his marriage, and everything that he had believed in. And then, as if to confirm his worst fear, he saw Lexi step out of her car. She wasn't alone. She was with Marcus. His stomach turned, his chest tightened. He wanted to scream, to run to her, to demand answers, but he stayed frozen in his seat, watching them walk together into the hotel, their hands brushing against each other, too close, too intimate. Lexi had lied to him. She had betrayed him. John's mind raced as the truth settled in. His marriage, his life, wasn't what he thought it was. And now he had a choice. He could confront her, demand answers, or he could walk away. He wasn't sure if he could ever walk away from her. John's hands gripped the steering wheel as if it were the only thing holding him together. His mind raced. Every fiber of his being wanted to storm into that hotel, demand answers, confront Lexi, and drag her out of there. But he couldn't. At least not yet. Not until he understood what he was dealing with. He watched as Lexi and Marcus entered the hotel, their movements slow, almost deliberate. John's chest tightened, his breath shallow. It wasn't just the sight of them together. It was the certainty that this was real. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't an accident. He had seen enough. John's fingers trembled as he picked up his phone, quickly dialing Marcus's number from memory. He had met Marcus a few times in passing at business events, but this was different. This wasn't a simple exchange of pleasantries. This was something else. This was about his marriage, his life. The phone rang, and then Marcus picked up. "Hello?" John's voice was strained, cold. "Marcus." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. John could almost hear the confusion, followed by the realization. "John? What's going on?" "I know what's happening," John said, his voice sharp, not a hint of hesitation. "I know about you and Lexi." There was a long silence. John's grip tightened on the phone. The raw anger coursing through him made it hard to stay composed, but he had to. He couldn't let Marcus see the cracks. "John, I don't know what you think you saw," Marcus started, but there was no conviction in his voice. "I think you're mistaken." John didn't let him finish. "Don't lie to me, Marcus. I saw you with her, at the hotel. You think I don't know? You think I didn't notice? You think I couldn't feel it? The way she's been acting, the way she's been pulling away from me for weeks. Don't tell me this is just a mistake." Marcus was silent for a moment, and when he spoke again, it wasn't with the confidence he'd had before. It was more guarded, defensive. "Look, I didn't mean for this to happen. It just did. She's been unhappy, John. She's been looking for something I could give her." John's mind reeled. A part of him wanted to shout, to lash out. Another part, a quieter part, wanted to hang up the phone and never deal with any of this again. But he couldn't. He had to know the truth, all of it. "So what? You think this is your right? To step in and take what's mine?" John's words came out colder than he expected, but they felt like a release. Marcus's tone shifted. "I never meant to hurt you. I'm not the bad guy here. She's the one who came to me. She's the one who—" John cut him off, his voice growing louder, more desperate. "Don't try to put this on her. She doesn't get to do this. I trusted her. I loved her, Marcus. And you knew what you were doing. You knew how much she meant to me. You knew how much she meant to us. But you still went after her." There was another long pause before Marcus spoke again, his voice quieter now. "I never wanted to hurt you, John. I'm sorry you had to find out this way." The apology felt empty. It wasn't an apology for what had happened. It was an apology for being caught, for being exposed. John felt his rage simmer beneath the surface, the urge to confront both of them overwhelming. But deep down he knew it wasn't Marcus he needed to confront. Not yet. It was Lexi. "I don't care about your apologies, Marcus," John said, the words coming out with more force than he had intended. "I want you to stay away from my wife, from my life, from everything." "John, I'm done. We're done," John snapped. He slammed the phone down with a finality that echoed in his mind long after the call ended. For a long moment, John sat there in the car, staring at the hotel. His heart was pounding, but there was no sense of relief, no victory, just emptiness. The weight of betrayal pressing against him like a physical force. The truth was clear now, but it didn't make anything easier. If anything, it made everything worse. Lexi had crossed a line. She had chosen someone else, and no matter what happened next, nothing would ever be the same. He took a deep breath, his chest heavy with the realization that the love he thought was unshakable had been shattered. And now, he had to figure out how to pick up the pieces. John sat at the kitchen table, his hands gripping the edge so tightly his knuckles turned white. The silence between him and Lexi was suffocating, thick with tension and unspoken words. The only sound was the ticking of the clock on the wall, the seconds slipping away like grains of sand through his fingers. Lexi stood near the doorway, her body tense, as though she were bracing herself for an inevitable storm. She didn't look at him, didn't say anything. Her eyes were fixed on the floor, a guilty silence hanging between them like an unbearable weight. The truth was already out there, hanging in the air. He didn't need to ask. He didn't need more evidence. The hotel, the lies, the betrayal. It was all clear now, but that didn't make it any easier. Nothing could have prepared him for the moment he was about to face. Finally, John spoke, his voice low and strained. "You've been lying to me, Lexi, all this time. I don't even know who you are anymore. Lexi's breath hitched, but she didn't look up. She just stood there, her shoulders slumped as if she'd already given up. She opened her mouth, but the words didn't come. Her silence felt like a confession all on its own. She knew this moment was coming, but she wasn't ready to face it. John's chest tightened, his heart heavy with the weight of what he had learned. He wanted answers. He needed them, but he couldn't bring himself to ask. Finally, Lexi spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never meant for this to happen, John." She paused, swallowing hard. "I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't know how to fix it." John clenched his jaw, his eyes narrowing. "Fix what, Lexi? Fix the fact that you've been seeing someone else behind my back? Fix the fact that you've betrayed me? You don't get to fix this." She flinched at the harshness in his voice, but he didn't care. He needed to hear the truth, the whole truth, and she owed it to him to say it, to stop hiding behind her shame. "I've been so lost," she continued, her voice cracking. I don't know how it happened. I never meant to hurt you. I swear I never meant to. But something was missing, something I didn't even realize until it was too late." John stood up, his legs shaky beneath him. The pain in his chest felt like a physical blow. He stepped closer to her, searching her face for any sign of remorse, any sign that she was still the woman he had loved. But there was nothing, just emptiness. "I trusted you, Lexi," he said, his voice barely audible, breaking under the weight of his hurt. "I gave you everything, and you gave me nothing in return." She finally looked up at him, her eyes swollen with tears. "I never meant for this to happen. I didn't want it to go this far." She wiped her tears, but they just kept coming. "I was lonely, John. I was so lonely, and Marcus, he was there. He made me feel something again. He made me feel wanted." The words hit him like a slap across the face. Lonely. That was her excuse. After everything they'd been through, everything they had shared, she had turned to another man to fill the emptiness inside her, to make her feel wanted. John took a step back, his chest tightening, his fists clenching. "So that's it? You couldn't talk to me? You couldn't come to me with this instead of running to him?" She shook her head, her hands trembling. "I tried, but you were always busy, always caught up in your work. You never had time for me anymore. I was invisible to you, John, and I couldn't keep pretending that I didn't feel it." The truth stung more than he could have imagined. He had been blind to her pain, too caught up in his own world to see the cracks forming in their relationship. He felt the guilt settle over him, but it was nothing compared to the burning anger and betrayal that consumed him now. "I didn't deserve this," he muttered, his voice hoarse. "You didn't even try. You didn't even talk to me. You just ran." "I'm sorry," Lexi whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know how to fix us. I didn't know how to fix me." The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. John's heart shattered as he realized the woman standing in front of him, the woman he had loved, was no longer the person he thought she was. She had given up, and now everything was broken. "Tell me it's not true," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Tell me you didn't love him. Tell me I didn't mean nothing to you." She opened her mouth, but no words came out. She shook her head, unable to give him the one thing he needed, reassurance that it wasn't all a lie. And in that moment, John knew it was over. He took a deep breath and turned away, his heart heavy with the realization that he had lost her. Forever. John didn't sleep that night. The silence in their house was deafening. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant car honking outside felt like it was echoing through the walls, reminding him of the void that had suddenly opened up in his life. He stared at the ceiling for hours, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on him, suffocating him. Lexi's confession played over and over in his mind, each word, each tear hitting him harder than the last. She had betrayed him, and though she was sorry, he wasn't sure if that made it better or worse. At first, he had wanted answers. He needed to know why she had done it, why she hadn't come to him when she was unhappy. But now, all of that seemed irrelevant. There was no going back. The trust they had built, the love they had shared, it was shattered beyond repair. The phone buzzed beside him. It was from Lexi. He couldn't bring himself to look at it. He knew what it would say. Another apology, another attempt to fix things that couldn't be fixed. He reached for his phone anyway, almost as if drawn to it by some invisible force. "I'm sorry, John. I never meant to hurt you. Can we please talk?" He stared at the message for a long time. What was there left to say? What was the point of talking when the trust between them had been destroyed? He had always believed in second chances, but this felt different. He didn't respond. His mind wandered to the past, to the times when things had been easy, when he had woken up next to Lexi and felt like nothing could ever break them apart. They had been a team, had built a life together, and now, in a single moment, it all felt like it was slipping away, like sand between his fingers. He knew he had to speak to her eventually. He knew there had to be a conversation, but right now, he couldn't bring himself to do it. He wasn't ready. Hours passed, and the house stayed quiet, but his mind wouldn't quiet down. He could still see the image of Lexi and Marcus together, their hands brushing as they walked into the hotel, their secret finally exposed. It was like a vision that wouldn't leave him. He had seen enough, but now, every time he closed his eyes, it played in his mind like a film reel he couldn't stop. Finally, Lexi came home. She entered through the front door, looking smaller than usual, her face drawn, pale from the sleepless night she must have had. She didn't speak at first. She didn't need to. The air between them was thick with unspoken words. John remained seated at the kitchen table, his eyes fixed on the glass of water in front of him, unwilling to look up. He couldn't look at her yet. She began, but her voice cracked and she stopped herself. John still didn't speak. His silence was deafening, a clear wall between them. Lexi walked closer, her footsteps slow, careful, like she was walking on broken glass. She finally sat across from him, her eyes searching his face, desperate for something, anything, that would tell her he was still the man she had married. But there was nothing. The man she had known was gone. In his place sat a man who was broken, a man who wasn't sure if he could forgive her. "I know I've hurt you," Lexi whispered, "and I know nothing I say can change that. But I need you to know it wasn't about you. It was never about you. It was me. I didn't know how to deal with what I was feeling. I felt so alone, John. And Marcus, he was there." John's breath caught in his throat. "You were never alone, Lexi," he said, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and pain. "I was right here. I gave you everything, and you still went to him. You still betrayed me." Lexi's eyes filled with tears. "I know. I didn't think. I wasn't thinking. And now I don't know how to fix this. I don't know how to make you see that I'm sorry. I never wanted to hurt you. I never wanted to lose you." John's heart ached, but the hurt was too much. He wanted to believe her. He wanted to forgive her. But could he? Could he ever see her the same way again? The question hung in the air, unanswered. The silence stretched out, a void neither of them could cross. "I need time, Lexi," John said finally, his voice cold but steady. "I need time to think, to process. I don't know what to do with this, with us. I don't know if I can move past this." Lexi nodded, her shoulders shaking as she wiped away her tears. "I understand," she whispered. John stood up, the weight of the moment sinking in. He could feel the loss, feel the love that was slipping through his fingers. He didn't want to make decisions in the heat of the moment. He needed to step back, to breathe, and to figure out if there was even a chance for them anymore. He left the room, not looking back. John sat at the edge of the bed, his hands trembling as he held his phone. He had spent the last few days avoiding Lexi, keeping a distance that only seemed to widen between them. But this was different. He wasn't looking for an excuse to fight. He wasn't even sure what he was looking for anymore. But when the message came, he couldn't ignore it. It was from Laura. "John, I need to tell you something. It's important. Please call me." His stomach dropped. Laura, Lexi's best friend. She knew what had happened. Had she known all along? Could she shed some light on what had been going on in Lexi's mind? Or had there been more to the story than he realized? He dialed the number, the call ringing only once before Laura picked up. "John?" she asked, her voice strained. "Laura," John said, his tone cold. "What's going on? What's this about?" There was a long pause. He could hear her breathing, heavy and unsure, as if she didn't know how to say what needed to be said. "John, I didn't want to tell you this, but I think you have a right to know," Laura began, her words slow and deliberate. "There's something you don't know, something I should have told you before." John's heart pounded, his mind raced. "What do you mean? What aren't you telling me?" She hesitated, as though she was afraid to speak, but she pushed on. "I knew about the affair, but that's not all." John's throat tightened. "What do you mean? You knew? You knew and didn't tell me?" His voice broke, the hurt and betrayal flooding in like a wave. "I never meant for you to find out like this, John. I was trying to protect you, to protect Lexi. I thought maybe things would settle, but now I realize I was wrong. You have to understand, she was already gone long before she met Marcus." "What the hell does that mean, Laura?" John asked, his voice rising with every word. He couldn't breathe. The anger swirled inside him like a storm, but he forced himself to keep calm. "Lexi, she was never happy, John," Laura said softly, as though she was afraid to say it aloud. "But what you don't know is that this wasn't just about Marcus. It started a lot earlier. She had been seeing other people for months." John's world stopped. For a second he thought he had misheard her. "What do you mean, she had other affairs? Not just Marcus?" Laura's voice quivered. "Yes. I didn't want to believe it, but I saw the signs. There were others, people from her past. She told me once that she had to find something, someone who would give her the attention she was missing, that you—" Laura stopped, her breath shaky. "That you weren't enough for her anymore." John felt like the ground had been ripped out from under him. The foundation he had spent years building, the life he had carefully crafted, all of it, gone. A lie, a betrayal that had been brewing for months, if not years. "You're telling me that she's been seeing other people this whole time?" His voice barely reached above a whisper, his words thick with disbelief. "Why didn't you tell me, Laura? Why the hell didn't you warn me?" "I didn't know how, John. I thought she'd change. I thought she'd come back to you, to us. But she didn't. She kept it hidden, and I didn't want to tear everything apart by telling you. I didn't want to hurt you more than you already were." John slammed his fist against the nightstand, the pain in his knuckles dulling the ache in his chest, but nothing could stop it. He was shattered, broken in ways he hadn't expected. "I have to see her," John muttered, his voice hoarse. "I have to confront her." "No, John, don't." Laura's warning was weak, but John didn't listen. He couldn't. He hung up and stood up, his body moving on autopilot, every step heavier than the last. He didn't know if he was ready for the confrontation, but he had no choice. He couldn't keep living in this limbo. The lies were too deep, too suffocating. He grabbed his coat, walked out the door, and drove. His hands were steady on the wheel, his mind numb with fury and disbelief. Every moment, every revelation from Laura seemed to slice through him again and again. How had he been so blind? How had he missed the signs? When he arrived home, he found Lexi sitting on the couch, her eyes swollen, her face a mixture of regret and something else, a quiet, unspoken guilt. John walked in and stood in front of her, his chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. "So it wasn't just Marcus," John said, his voice dark, almost too calm. "You've been seeing other people, haven't you?" Lexi's face went pale. "John, please." "No," he cut her off, stepping forward. "I've had enough of the lies. Enough of you hiding behind your excuses. You've been lying to me for months. You think an apology is enough? After everything? After all of this?" Her silence answered him. Her eyes welled up with tears, but John couldn't bring himself to care. The betrayal had cut too deep. He took a step back, his voice cold and final. "I don't know who you are anymore, Lexi, but I can't keep doing this. I can't keep living a lie." The words hung in the air, and for the first time John didn't feel any relief. No closure, just an overwhelming emptiness. John hadn't expected it to be this hard. He thought he had made up his mind, thought he was ready to let go, to walk away from the woman who had betrayed him in ways he never thought possible. But as the days passed, the weight of that decision grew heavier with each breath he took. The silence in the house was suffocating, and even though Lexi had moved out, staying with a friend, he presumed, her presence lingered everywhere. The smell of her perfume on the pillow, her things scattered across their home, reminders of the life they had once shared. Every room felt empty now, a hollow shell of the love that had once filled it. John sat at the kitchen table, staring at the cup of coffee in front of him. He hadn't touched it. His mind was elsewhere, caught in a battle between the man he used to be and the one he was becoming. He had loved Lexi with everything he had, but now he wasn't sure who he was anymore. He wasn't sure who she was either. The phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. He pulled it out, expecting another message from Lexi. She had called a few times over the past week, her voice filled with apologies, but he had ignored each one. It wasn't that he didn't want to hear her side, to understand why she had done what she did, but there was nothing left to say, nothing left to fix. He unlocked his phone and checked the message. "John, please let me explain. I know I hurt you, but I don't want to lose you. I'll do whatever it takes to make things right." John stared at the words. His thumb hovered over the screen, the cursor blinking at him as if waiting for him to respond. Part of him wanted to call her. He missed her. He missed the woman she had been before all of this. But another part of him, a stronger part, knew that talking to her wouldn't change anything. There were too many lies, too much betrayal. He put the phone down without responding. The problem wasn't just Lexi. It wasn't only her affair, it was everything they had built, everything that had been shattered in the blink of an eye. He had trusted her. He had given her his heart, and she had taken it and crushed it. But there was a bigger question that haunted him. Could he ever move on? Could he rebuild his life, his heart, after all of this? Days turned into weeks, and John's routine became a blur. He went to work, saw friends, even tried to go on dates. But nothing felt right. He would find himself sitting in front of a woman, her smile warm and inviting, and all he could think about was Lexi. Her laughter, her touch, the way she made him feel safe, the way she had been his home. Now all of that felt like a distant memory. He tried to throw himself into work. He immersed himself in projects, meetings, anything that could take his mind off the mess he had to deal with. But the more he worked, the more his thoughts strayed back to her. How had it all gone so wrong? How could they have gone from being in love, partners in every sense of the word, to strangers? He thought about calling her. Maybe he had been too hasty. Maybe he could forgive her. After all, they had been through so much together. Couldn't they start over? Wasn't that what love was supposed to be about? Second chances? But then he remembered the look in her eyes when she confessed everything, the way she had broken down, the guilt and shame in her face, but also something else, a detachment, as if she had already given up on their marriage long before she'd met Marcus. John didn't know what to do. He didn't know if he could ever forgive her, or if he even wanted to. He felt so lost. His heart ached, but it wasn't the same ache he had felt when he loved her. Now it was just emptiness, like a wound that wouldn't heal. It was late one night, after another long day at work, when John found himself walking through the park near his apartment. The night was quiet, the streetlights casting long shadows on the path. He hadn't meant to come here. It just felt like the only place that made sense. He stopped by a bench, sitting down and staring at the dark water of the small pond in front of him. His mind wandered back to his conversation with Laura, where she had said that he couldn't blame Lexi entirely. "She's been unhappy for a long time," Laura had said. "You didn't see it, John. You didn't see her pulling away from you." But wasn't it her fault, too? She had made the choice. She had chosen Marcus over him. She had walked away from their marriage, no matter how much she tried to explain it. John closed his eyes, taking in a deep breath. He didn't know what the future held. Maybe he would find peace. Maybe he would learn to forgive. But for now, he needed time. Time to heal. Time to figure out what came next. The pain would eventually fade. He knew that. It had to. But in the silence of the night, sitting on that bench, John finally realized something. He didn't need to move on for her. He needed to move on for himself. He stood up, feeling the weight of the decision settle in his chest. It was time to let go. Time to let go of the past and rebuild, one step at a time. John woke up that morning with a deep sense of heaviness in his chest, like something was pressing down on him, suffocating him. He had spent so many nights in this state, tossing and turning, haunted by thoughts of what had happened, by the woman who had shattered his trust. But today was different. Today he had to make a decision, a final decision. He stood in front of the mirror, his reflection staring back at him, a man who felt like a stranger. The person who had once believed in love, in loyalty, in commitment, was gone. He had given everything to Lexi, but now that version of himself seemed like someone he barely recognized. His phone buzzed again, another message from her. "John, I miss you. I need to talk. Please." The words burned into him. She had sent him the same message for days now, begging for a conversation, for forgiveness. But no matter how many times she apologized, how many tears she shed, John knew it wasn't enough. He had reached his breaking point. Lexi had been his world, his home. But now he couldn't look at her without seeing the lies, the secrets, and the betrayal. He had tried. He had tried so hard to forgive her, to see beyond what she had done. But each day it became clearer that what they had wasn't enough to survive this. He didn't pick up his phone. He couldn't. Instead, he sat down at the kitchen table, his hands clasped together in front of him, the weight of the decision pressing down on his shoulders. It had been weeks since the confrontation, weeks since he had learned the truth, but the truth still stung like it was fresh. Every night he asked himself the same question. Could he move past this? Could he let go of the woman who had once been his everything? And every night the answer was the same. No, he couldn't. John stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. He walked to the door, pausing for a moment before opening it. The sun had barely risen, and the world outside seemed quiet, almost too quiet. He didn't know where he was going, but he couldn't stay here. He couldn't stay in this house, surrounded by memories of a life that no longer felt like his. He got into his car and drove, his mind racing with every turn of the wheel. He didn't know what he expected to find, answers, clarity, peace. But he knew he couldn't stay locked in this emotional prison any longer. It was time for him to move forward. He didn't know how, but he had to. The drive seemed endless, but eventually he found himself at the beach. He hadn't planned it, but the crashing waves and the cool breeze calmed his restless mind. He sat on the sand, the salty air filling his lungs, and for the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to feel something beyond the anger, the hurt, the betrayal. John took a deep breath and closed his eyes. This was his moment. The moment he had to face the truth of his situation. He had to let go. He couldn't keep clinging to a past that had already been torn apart. He couldn't keep hoping for something that was never going to happen. He had loved Lexi. He had trusted her more than anyone else. But now, that love had turned into a hollow ache, a wound that no amount of apologies or tears could heal. It wasn't her fault alone. He had his own part to play in their downfall. They had both failed each other in different ways. And now it was time to let go. With one last look at the horizon, John stood up and made his way back to the car. The decision was made. He wasn't going to go back to her. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was his to walk. The first steps were always the hardest. But this was it. He was letting go. He was moving on. And as he drove back home, a small, almost imperceptible weight lifted off his chest. It wasn't peace, not yet, but it was the beginning of something new. The silence in Lexi's apartment was suffocating. She sat on the edge of the couch, her hands tightly clutching a pillow as if it could somehow shield her from the storm inside. Her eyes were bloodshot, the result of nights spent crying, of wondering how everything had gone so wrong. She had expected him to be angry, expected him to leave, to walk away from her and never look back. But what had actually happened, what was happening now, was worse. She felt like she had lost him, not just in the moment of betrayal, but in every step leading up to it. Her phone buzzed on the table, a message from a friend, but she didn't have the strength to look at it. What was there to say? How could she explain what she had done? How could she apologize for something that had already ripped her life apart? The guilt was suffocating. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw John's face, saw the pain in his eyes when she confessed. She had been weak. She had chosen Marcus, chosen someone who had given her attention when John had been busy, when he was focused on everything but her. And now she was left with nothing. She couldn't blame him for walking away. He had every right to. But the thought of never seeing him again, of never feeling his arms around her, of losing him completely, it felt like a weight she couldn't carry. The life they had built, the dreams they had shared, seemed so far out of reach now. Lexi ran her fingers through her hair, her thoughts spiraling, tangled in a mess of regret and self-loathing. How had she let it get this far? How had she convinced herself that what she was doing was justified, that it was just a fleeting mistake? She had hurt him. She had betrayed the one person who had loved her unconditionally. And for what? A fleeting connection with someone else? The truth was, Marcus had never truly cared for her. He had been a distraction, someone to fill the emptiness inside her, someone to make her feel alive again. But even as she had been with him, she had known it wasn't right. She had known that no one could replace what she had with John. Yet in the moment, it had felt like she had no choice. The loneliness, the dissatisfaction, it had consumed her. But now, with everything in pieces around her, she couldn't understand why she hadn't fought harder to fix it. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from her mother. "Are you okay, honey? You've been distant lately. I'm worried about you." Lexi felt a lump form in her throat. How could she tell her mother the truth? How could she explain what she had done, knowing it would disappoint her, knowing it would break her heart? She buried her face in her hands, her sobs uncontrollable now. She had no one to blame but herself. She had pushed John away, let her own insecurities and loneliness take hold, and in the process, she had destroyed the one good thing in her life. She had tried to tell herself that it was just a phase, just something she could fix later. But now, later had come, and there was no fixing it. John was gone, and all she had left were the shattered pieces of a life she had taken for granted. Lexi stood up, pacing the small apartment. She didn't know what to do, didn't know how to make it right. She had already apologized to him, begged him to give her a chance to explain, but nothing she said had mattered. The damage had been done. Her phone buzzed once more, and this time, it was a call. She didn't have to look at the screen to know who it was, John. She hesitated, her finger hovering over the answer button. What was there to say to him now? Could she really make him understand the depth of her regret? Could she tell him that she was sorry without it sounding like an excuse? With trembling hands, she answered, "John?" Her voice was small, fragile. "Please, I'm so sorry. I know I can't undo what I've done, but I need you to know how much I regret it. I never meant to hurt you. I never meant to throw away everything we had." There was silence on the other end of the line. Lexi closed her eyes, willing herself not to cry. "I've thought about it every day, John. Every moment I've spent without you. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I need you to understand. You meant everything to me." A long pause. "I'm so sorry, John. I don't know how to fix this. I don't know if I can, but please, please don't hate me." She could hear him breathing on the other end, his silence cutting through her like a blade. She waited, but the words she needed, those final words of closure, of hope, never came. And then, with one final crushing blow, John spoke. "It's over, Lexi." The finality in his voice shattered her. "Goodbye," he said. The call ended. Lexi collapsed to the floor, her body racked with sobs. The world had come crashing down, and this time there was no one left to pick up the pieces. John's footsteps echoed down the empty hall as he walked toward the door. He had made the decision, and now he had to face the consequences. The finality of it all weighed heavily on him, each step feeling like a burden that he couldn't escape. He had spent so many nights questioning himself, wondering if he was doing the right thing, wondering if there was a chance to repair what had been broken. But deep down, he knew there was nothing left to fix. The trust had been shattered beyond repair, and no amount of apologies, no amount of tears, could change that. As he reached the door, his hand hesitated on the handle. He glanced back over his shoulder at the life they had shared, the memories that had once filled this house. It had been a good life, full of laughter and love. But now, all of that felt like a distant dream, something that belonged to someone else. John took a deep breath, steadying himself. He had to do this. For himself. For his peace. He opened the door and stepped outside. Lexi was standing on the porch, her hands wringing in front of her face pale and drawn. She looked smaller somehow, broken in a way he had never seen before. Her eyes were filled with regret, but John couldn't bring himself to care anymore. He had seen that look before, too many times, and it didn't make a difference. "John." Lexi's voice cracked as she spoke his name, her words trembling. "Please, don't go. Please, let's talk." John didn't move. He stood there, looking at her, feeling the weight of everything that had happened between them. She was the woman he had loved, the woman he had given everything to, but that woman was gone, replaced by someone he didn't recognize. "I'm sorry," Lexi whispered, her voice barely audible. "I never meant to hurt you. I never wanted to lose you." John looked at her, his heart heavy, his soul tired. "You already did, Lexi," he said, his voice steady but filled with pain. "You lost me the moment you made that choice, the moment you decided I wasn't enough for you." Her eyes filled with tears, but John didn't flinch. He couldn't. "I tried, John," she said, her voice pleading now. "I tried to make it work, but I was lost. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to fix it." John shook his head slowly, a bitter smile curling at the corner of his lips. "You didn't try, Lexi. You ran. You ran straight into someone else's arms instead of coming to me, instead of talking to me." She took a step forward, reaching out for him, but he took a step back, his eyes cold and distant. "Please don't," he said, his voice laced with finality. "You've made your choice, and now I'm making mine." The silence between them was thick, heavy with everything they had lost. John could feel the weight of it pressing on him, but he refused to let it break him. He had given everything, and now he was done. "I loved you, Lexi," he said, his voice raw. "I loved you with everything I had, but you broke me. You broke us." Tears streamed down her face now, her sobs shaking her body. She reached out again, but John didn't move. He couldn't. "I don't know how to fix this, John," she whispered through her tears. "I don't know what to do anymore." John closed his eyes for a moment, the pain in his chest unbearable. He had loved her, he had given her everything, but love wasn't enough. Trust was, and trust had been destroyed. "You can't fix this, Lexi," he said softly, his words final. "You broke us, and I can't go back. I can't pretend like everything is okay because it's not." He took one last look at her, at the woman he had once believed in, but now all he saw was a stranger who had betrayed him in the worst possible way. "I hope you find what you're looking for," he said quietly before turning away. Lexi's voice called out to him, desperate, but John didn't look back. He couldn't. He walked away from the house, from the life they had built, from the love they had once shared. And as he stepped into the unknown, he finally realized that he was free. Free from the lies, free from the pain. And for the first time in months, John felt like he could breathe again. The house was quiet. Too quiet, as though the air itself held its breath, waiting. James sat on the edge of the bed, his fingers tracing the worn edges of the old photograph he had found tucked away in the drawer earlier that morning. It was a picture of the two of them, taken during a trip to the mountains when everything seemed so simple, so effortless. They were smiling, genuinely completely lost in the moment. It felt like a lifetime ago, and in some ways it was. Katie entered the room, her footsteps slow, almost hesitant. She paused in the doorway for a moment, her gaze lingering on him. Her eyes had lost some of the sharpness they once had. There was a softness there now, something almost fragile, like she was afraid to break whatever delicate thread still connected them. "I know you've been thinking," she said, her voice soft but steady. "I've been thinking too." James didn't answer immediately. His eyes never left the photo. "Do you ever wonder, Katie?" he said quietly. how we got here, how we ended up in this place where everything feels so broken. Katie sighed, crossing the room and sitting beside him on the bed. She didn't touch him, but she was close enough that he could feel the warmth of her presence. She had always been able to make him feel that way, even in silence. "I don't know," she said after a beat, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never meant for any of this to happen, but I can't change the past. All I can do is face it, and face what we are now." James looked at her, really looked at her for the first time in what felt like forever. There was a vulnerability in her expression, something raw and unguarded. He hadn't seen it this clearly since before the betrayal. "I keep asking myself if we'll ever be able to forget," he murmured. "If we can go back to who we were, but I'm not sure it's even possible. And maybe that's okay." Katie's hand found his, tentative at first, but then with a quiet certainty. "I don't think we can go back, James. Not to what we were, but that doesn't mean we can't move forward. Maybe not as who we were, but as who we could be. Together. Or apart, if that's what we need." James absorbed her words, the weight of them settling into him. There was truth in what she was saying, an uncomfortable, painful truth. They couldn't erase the past, but maybe they could find a way to move beyond it. Maybe closure wasn't about forgetting. It was about accepting what had happened and finding peace with it. "I've been holding on to the hurt for so long," James admitted, his voice barely audible. "It's been easier to stay angry, to stay in this place where I feel justified in my pain. But maybe it's time to let go, to accept that what's done is done." Katie nodded, her fingers gently tightening around his. "I don't want you to carry that anger anymore, James. It's been too heavy for you, for both of us." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and in that moment he realized just how much she had changed, how much they both had. They were no longer the same people they had been when they first met, young, naive, full of hope. They had been forged by the fire of their experiences, tempered by pain and regret, but also by resilience. Maybe that was the key to moving forward, accepting who they were now, not who they used to be. "I don't know if I can forgive you," James said honestly, his voice shaking slightly. "But I don't think I need to. Not anymore. What I need is to move on, to find some kind of peace. And I think that's what we both need." Katie's eyes filled with tears again, but this time there was something different in them. It wasn't guilt or shame. It was relief, as if a heavy burden had been lifted from her shoulders. "I just want you to be happy, James. I want you to be whole again, even if that doesn't mean being with me." Her words hung in the air between them, heavy with the truth they both knew but hadn't yet said aloud. James could feel the weight of that truth sinking into his bones, and for the first time in weeks he felt like he could breathe again. He didn't know what the future held, or if they would ever truly heal, but he knew that this moment, this fragile, painful moment, was the first step toward something else, something more. He turned his hand in hers, his fingers locking with hers in a gesture that felt natural, even after all the time that had passed. They sat like that for a long time, not speaking, just being. There were no promises in the air, no grand declarations, but there was understanding, and for the first time in a long while there was peace. Katie finally broke the silence, her voice soft but firm. "Maybe closure isn't about the end of something. Maybe it's just about the beginning of something new." James glanced at her, his eyes softening. "Maybe." A long moment passed before he spoke again. "We've been through so much, Katie, and I'm not sure we'll ever fully heal, but I'm willing to try. I'm willing to let go of the past and see where we go from here, together or apart." Katie smiled through her tears, a small, bittersweet smile. "That's all I can ask for." And for the first time in a long while, James felt like the weight of the world had been lifted from his shoulders. It wasn't about forgetting, and it wasn't about pretending things had never happened. It was about finding closure, about accepting that the past was part of them, but not the only part. It was time to move forward. The morning light filtered through the curtains, casting soft shadows across the room. James woke with a start. his heart racing as memories from the night before surged back. But this time it wasn't the panic or confusion that greeted him. It was the quiet, the steady calm of knowing that something had shifted within him. He sat up slowly, feeling the weight of the past begin to lift, just a little. Katie was already up, her presence a subtle comfort in the stillness of the room. She was in the kitchen, moving quietly, preparing breakfast. The sound of the kettle boiling, the soft clinking of dishes, was a reminder of the mundane, the normalcy that had always eluded them. But today, for the first time in so long, it felt like a kind of peace was settling in. James stood up and made his way to the kitchen, the floor cold under his bare feet. He found Katie at the counter, stirring coffee grounds into the French press. She glanced up when she heard him enter, offering a small, tentative smile. It wasn't the smile of someone who had everything figured out, but it was genuine. That, he realized, was enough. "You're up early," he said, leaning against the doorframe. His voice was rough, still thick with the remnants of sleep. Katie nodded, her eyes focused on the coffee. "I couldn't sleep much. My mind's still running a bit wild." James chuckled softly, his own mind still clouded with 1,000 thoughts. But those thoughts didn't feel as oppressive anymore. They didn't carry the weight of unresolved anger or the ache of betrayal. They were just thoughts, pieces of a puzzle he was slowly learning to put together. "Yeah, mine too," he replied. "But I feel different today, lighter somehow." Katie looked up at him, her expression thoughtful. "I know what you mean." There was a silence between them, a comfortable one this time as they both took in the change in the air, the change in themselves. They weren't there yet, nowhere near it actually. But there was progress, and for the first time in a long time James could see it. He could feel it like a small ember slowly warming up from within. Katie poured 2 cups of coffee and handed one to him. Their fingers brushed briefly and he couldn't ignore the subtle jolt of recognition. She was still Katie, still the woman he'd once loved. Maybe in time they could find their way back to each other. Maybe not. But the important thing was that they were here in this moment, trying. "Do you ever think about how things might have been different?" Katie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. James took a sip of his coffee, savoring the warmth. He didn't answer right away, letting the question settle into him. The what-ifs had plagued him for so long. What if he had done things differently? What if she hadn't made that choice? But now it didn't feel as urgent. The past had happened, and while it couldn't be undone, it also didn't have to define them. Not anymore. "Sometimes," he said finally, "but I don't think it matters anymore. What matters is what we do now, what we choose to become from here on out." Katie nodded, looking down at her coffee, tracing the rim of the mug with her finger. "Yeah, I guess I've been holding on to so much to the way things used to be, but I think it's time I let go. Not just of you, of us, but of all the anger, the guilt. I don't want to carry that anymore." James studied her, feeling a mix of admiration and sorrow. She was stronger than he had ever given her credit for. He knew it wasn't easy for her to let go of the past, to move forward after everything that had happened, but she was doing it. They both were. "I'm sorry, Katie," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "For everything, for not being who you needed me to be." Katie lifted her head and met his gaze, her eyes filled with a softness he hadn't seen in years. "You don't have to apologize. We both made mistakes, but we're still here, and that's something. We're still standing." There was a strength in her words that he hadn't expected, and for the first time he felt a sense of mutual understanding between them. It wasn't about forgiveness, not entirely. It wasn't about forgetting either. It was about acceptance, accepting what they had been, what they had lost, and what they were now becoming. "I don't think I've fully forgiven myself yet," James admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "But I'm working on it. And maybe one day I'll forgive you too. Not because I have to, but because it's the only way to move forward." Katie's lips curled into a sad, knowing smile. "I don't need you to forgive me, James. I don't need anything from you anymore. I've had to learn how to forgive myself, to move on, and I think I'm finally starting to. I think we both are." For a long time they sat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. But this time the silence didn't feel oppressive. It didn't feel like the end. It felt like the beginning of something new, something better. They were healing in their own ways, at their own pace, but they were healing. "I don't know what's next for us," Katie said after a while, her voice gentle. "But I know we have to find our own way. Whether it's together or apart, we both deserve to be happy." James nodded, his heart lighter than it had been in months. "Yeah, I think that's the most important thing. Happiness, we deserve that." And as they sat together in the kitchen, sipping their coffee in comfortable silence, James knew that healing didn't happen all at once. It wasn't something you could rush or force. It was a slow, steady process, one that took time and patience, but it was happening. It was happening right now in this moment, and that was enough. The city had a way of changing as the seasons did. The air was crisp with the first hints of spring, but beneath it, there was a subtle warmth, a sense of renewal. James walked through the familiar streets, his steps lighter than they'd been in years. His thoughts were no longer consumed by the ghosts of his past. The weight that had once burdened him seemed to lift with every step, as if the city itself was welcoming him back into the world. Katie had come to a quiet understanding with him, but their paths had started to diverge in the most natural way. They were both healing, but their healing was happening separately, in ways that were true to who they were now. James had spent so much time looking backward, unsure if he would ever feel whole again, but the process of moving forward had begun, and it had begun with one simple truth. He was ready to love again. But this time, it wouldn't be the same. The first time he saw Emma, he hadn't known what to expect. She was a friend of a friend, someone who'd crossed his path at a gathering. He had been skeptical at first. After everything he'd gone through, could he really open his heart to someone new? He'd barely allowed himself the space to consider it. But then, there she was, smiling at him across the room, her presence gentle but assured. They had talked for hours that night, about everything and nothing. There was an ease to her conversation, a kind of effortless connection that he hadn't realized he was craving. She didn't judge him for his past, nor did she demand any explanation. She simply accepted him as he was, flawed, uncertain, but willing to try. "James," Emma had said one evening, her voice steady but with a glimmer of curiosity, "I know we've both been through a lot, but I think we owe it to ourselves to see where this goes." It was a simple invitation, nothing extravagant, nothing demanding, but it was enough. He knew deep down that he was ready. He didn't have to force it. The connection was there, and it was real. Slowly, over the following weeks, he allowed himself to step deeper into the possibility of something new. It wasn't about erasing the past, it was about acknowledging it and choosing to love again despite it. The first time they kissed, it was gentle, tender, a soft exhale that seemed to let go of everything that had come before. It wasn't a dramatic moment, it didn't change the world, but it was a promise, a quiet assurance that he could still love and that love could be kind. It was a moment he'd been too afraid to let himself have until now. But love wasn't just about the romantic moments. It was the little things. The way Emma would brush a stray lock of hair behind his ear when he laughed too hard. The way she would sit quietly next to him, content in the shared silence. There was no need for pretenses between them. There was only the growing certainty that, after all the heartbreak and loss, this was something worth fighting for. Katie had known about Emma. She had seen the way James smiled more freely when they spoke, how his eyes held a lightness they hadn't in a long time. There was no animosity between them, no jealousy. In fact, she seemed to encourage it, in her own subtle way. She had her own path to walk, and though it was difficult to accept at first, she understood that James needed this. He needed the space to grow, to find his way toward happiness again. "I'm glad you found her," Katie had said one evening when they ran into each other at a local cafe. "I always hoped you'd find someone who makes you smile like that." James hadn't known what to say, so he simply smiled. He didn't need to explain himself to her. There was no longer any need to justify his choices. The past was behind them, and they had both found their own versions of healing. In the quiet of their conversation, he realized that they had come to an unspoken agreement, a mutual understanding that, in their own ways, they were both moving forward. And Emma? She had never pushed him, never asked him to be anything other than what he was. She knew he was still working through the remnants of his past, but she loved him for who he was, not for who he might become. It was a refreshing kind of love, simple, uncomplicated. She was not there to fill a void in his heart. She was there because, in her own quiet way, she brought joy to his life. And that was enough. It was a slow kind of love, the kind that grew gradually without rushing, without the weight of expectations. James had learned the hard way that love was not a cure for pain. But with Emma, it felt like the beginning of something new. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't without its own challenges, but it was honest, and it was theirs. Together, they had learned to walk forward, not forgetting the past, but letting it fade into the distance. The day he realized he was truly in love with Emma was not a grand moment, but a quiet one. They had spent the afternoon walking through the park, their fingers interlaced. The sun was setting, painting the sky with hues of pink and orange. As they reached the bench by the lake, James sat down, pulling Emma beside him. She rested her head on his shoulder, and for the first time in a long time, he felt whole. "I think I'm falling for you," he whispered, the words slipping out without hesitation. Emma's smile was soft, but her eyes held a depth of understanding. "I think I'm falling for you too." And in that moment, with the world fading away around them, James realized that love wasn't something that could be forced. It wasn't a way to escape the past or erase the scars. It was simply a way to move forward. It was a quiet, gentle thing that asked nothing but for you to be open to it. And with Emma, he was open. James stood at the edge of the lake, watching the way the moonlight reflected off the water. The evening was quiet, save for the soft rustle of leaves and the distant hum of the city. It was a place he'd come to often, a place where his thoughts could settle, where he could breathe without feeling like the world was rushing past him. Today, he wasn't sure if he was ready to breathe. Emma had left for the weekend to visit family, and for the first time in months, he had time to reflect, not just on his life now, but on the road he had walked to get here. It hadn't been an easy road, and it certainly hadn't been straight. There had been detours, dead ends, moments of silence and confusion, and yet somehow he had arrived at this moment, standing at the edge of something new, something real. But even in the quiet peace of the moment, there was still something unfinished, something lingering. The door to his past had never truly closed, and as much as he had tried to move forward, the echoes of old regrets were still there, waiting to be addressed. His phone buzzed in his pocket, the sound sharp in the stillness. It was a message from Katie. He hesitated for a moment, then opened it. "I'm leaving tomorrow," she wrote. "I need to take the next step. I hope you understand." James swallowed hard, reading the words again. Katie had been a part of his life for so long, and though they had gone their separate ways emotionally, this final step, her leaving, felt like a closing chapter he hadn't fully prepared for. They had been through so much together, and yet somehow they were standing at the threshold of finality. There had been a time when he thought he might never be able to say goodbye to her. After all, she had been there through the darkest moments of his life, the person who knew him better than anyone else. But the truth was they had already said goodbye a long time ago in ways that couldn't be undone. The closure had been there, hiding beneath layers of unspoken words and what-ifs. It had simply taken him this long to recognize it. With a deep breath, James typed his response. "I understand. Take care of yourself." The words felt like a release, a weight lifted. He wasn't sure if he was ready for the finality of it, but he knew that for both of them, this was the right step. They needed to go their own ways now, to heal in their own time, without the tether of an old relationship holding them back. He sat down on the bench near the water, his hands folded in his lap. He closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the cool night air against his skin. The world was still, and for once he didn't feel the need to rush forward, to force anything. He had done so much of that, tried so hard to make sense of it all. But now it felt like the end of a chapter, a long, winding chapter, and he could finally, truly close the book. There were no grand gestures, no dramatic farewells. The final goodbye was quieter than he had imagined. It was in the simple acceptance of what had been, and in the quiet certainty that they were both moving on. A soft voice broke the silence. "You okay?" He turned to find Emma standing a few feet away, her eyes soft with concern. She had come back early from her trip, sensing that he needed her in a way he hadn't known how to express. He smiled at her, though it didn't reach his eyes completely. The truth was, he was okay, but there was still a sense of loss, a residue from the past that he couldn't entirely shake off. "Yeah," he said, his voice steady. "Just letting go of some things." Emma stepped closer, sitting down beside him. She didn't ask him to explain, didn't push for details. She simply sat, her presence comforting in its quiet strength. The space between them was filled with a kind of understanding, a knowing that transcended words. Sometimes it was enough just to be there, to share the silence. "You've come a long way," Emma said after a moment, her voice gentle. James nodded. "I have, but it doesn't make the goodbyes any easier." She smiled, her hand reaching to rest on his. "No, it doesn't, but they're necessary." His gaze lingered on the water, the ripples moving slowly across the surface. He didn't know if he would ever completely heal from everything he had been through, but he knew for the first time in a long time that he didn't have to. Healing wasn't a destination, it was a journey that he had started on his own, but had now found someone to walk beside him. There were still shadows in his heart, old wounds that would take time to fade. But with Emma, he felt the promise of something new, something that wasn't defined by the past. Love, he had learned, wasn't just about moving on. It was about embracing all of it, the pain, the loss, the growth, and finding beauty in the process. "I'm glad you're here," he said quietly. Emma squeezed his hand, her smile soft. "I'm not going anywhere." And just like that, the final goodbye, the one that had been looming in the background of his life, was no longer something to fear. It wasn't about cutting ties or erasing history. It was about accepting that the past had its place, but the future had its own possibilities. Together they sat in silence, watching the water ripple gently under the moonlight. There was no need for words, no need to rush. The journey ahead would unfold, step by step, as they both learned to let go of the past and embrace the future, whatever it might bring. The morning sun cut through the trees, casting long shadows on the road ahead. James stood at the entrance of his house, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The air was crisp, the kind that hinted at the change of seasons, as if the world itself was preparing for something new, something he hadn't quite expected but now felt was inevitable. The road ahead was no longer just a metaphor. It was real, a journey not just through the physical world, but through the emotional landscape he had spent years avoiding. His thoughts drifted to the past week. There had been so many moments, so many conversations that had led him to this point. The quiet acceptance of letting go of what was, and the fragile hope of what could be. It wasn't that everything was perfect, or that the world had suddenly aligned in his favor. It was more like a slow, steady realization that he had the power to shape his own path now, that for the first time in years he could finally choose where to go. He glanced back at the house, his home, the place that had been both a sanctuary and a prison, a place filled with memories, some bitter, some sweet, but no longer a place that confined him. Emma stepped out behind him, the soft rustle of her footsteps signaling her approach. She didn't need to say anything. Her presence was enough. He could feel the warmth of her, the quiet support she had shown him over the past months. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice a little softer than usual. James turned toward her, waiting for her to continue. He was so used to holding his breath when she spoke, as if expecting something heavy, something life-changing. But this time, her words were different. There was a calmness to them, a sense of peace. "What about?" he asked, stepping a little closer, his hand brushing hers. "About the road ahead," she said with a small smile. We've both been through so much, but now it feels like the world is opening up to us. I don't want to rush it, but I don't want to waste any more time either." James nodded, feeling a small surge of emotion he hadn't expected. "Me neither," he admitted. "I've spent so long looking back, I never really thought about what comes next." "I think it's time to start thinking about it," she said, squeezing his hand gently. He felt a sense of relief wash over him, mixed with a faint trace of fear. It wasn't about what came next. It was about the fact that he could choose. He had spent so much of his life letting circumstances push him forward. But now, standing with Emma, it felt like he had a voice, a choice. It was a terrifying, liberating thought. "You're right," he said finally. "It's time to stop looking behind and start looking forward." They stood there for a long moment, just breathing together, taking in the weight of those words. It wasn't a grand revelation, no dramatic shift in the universe, but it was something important, a simple decision that, in its own way, changed everything. James knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. It would be messy, unpredictable, and full of obstacles. But for the first time in his life, he felt ready to face it, not alone, but with Emma by his side. A light breeze stirred the leaves around them, carrying the scent of the earth and the promise of change. It was as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for them to take the next step. "I've been thinking," James said after a moment, his voice steady but full of meaning, "that maybe it's time for us to really build something together." Emma raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," he said with a slight shrug. I've been thinking about the future, and how we've both been so focused on our own individual journeys. But maybe now it's time to focus on something bigger. Together. The words felt strange as he said them, as though they were a promise he wasn't quite sure he was ready to make. But at the same time, they felt right. It wasn't just about the love they shared, or the bond that had formed between them over time. It was about a partnership, a commitment to something bigger than either of them could achieve alone. Emma took a deep breath, her eyes meeting his with a softness he hadn't seen before. "I think that sounds like the right kind of road to be on," she said quietly. James smiled, a mixture of hope and uncertainty flickering in his eyes. "Then let's take that first step." Without another word, they turned toward the road that lay before them. The path was open, the future uncertain, but together they felt stronger. The weight of past mistakes, the guilt, the regrets, they all seemed lighter now, as though they no longer had the power to hold him back. Emma's hand slipped into his, their fingers interlocking effortlessly. They walked forward in silence, each step in sync with the other. There was a sense of harmony between them, a quiet understanding that transcended everything they had been through. James wasn't sure where this road would take them. There would be challenges, moments of doubt, and probably more heartache along the way. But he was no longer afraid. The road ahead was no longer a place of fear and uncertainty. It was a place of opportunity. For the first time, he felt like he was truly living in the moment, and that was enough. As they walked, the sun began to climb higher in the sky, the light spreading over the world like a warm embrace. The future was out there, waiting, and together they would face it, whatever it brought.